Chapter 1. The Secret in the Northern Cave. The mist in the valley did not drift, it prowled. It clung to the ancient pines of the hunter's bank like wet wool, dampening sound and obscuring vision. For the inhabitants of Hunter's Keep, the fog was a warning, a shroud that hid the monsters waiting on the other side of the Silver River. But for Lyra, the mist was a blanket. It was the only thing that allowed her to disappear. She moved silently through the undergrowth, her boots sinking into the thick carpet of damp moss. The air here, close to the buffer zone known as the Northern Woods, smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of ozone. It was dangerous to be this far from the fortress, especially alone. Her father, Harkin, would lock her in the cellar for a week if he knew she had crossed the perimeter markers. Let him be angry, she thought, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of a cedar tree. Better angry than disappointed. She wasn't hunting game. The leather satchel slung across her chest was light, empty of traps or arrows. Instead, she was hunting solace. Lyra paused in a small clearing, her hand instinctively going to her waist. There, tucked securely in a hidden pocket of her woolen tunic, was a smooth cylinder of bamboo. She pulled it out, her thumb tracing the worn wood. It was an old flute, simple and unadorned, the bamboo aged to a warm honey color. It was the only thing her mother had left her before fading away like the morning mist, a secret legacy that Harkin forbade her to speak of. "Play for the trees, little one," her mother had whispered years ago. "Play for the wind. They listen better than men do." She didn't play it now. The silence of the woods felt too fragile to break. Instead, she pressed the cool wood against her cheek, closing her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't the disappointment of the legendary hunter Harkin. She was just Lyra. A sound shattered the stillness. It wasn't the chirping of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel. It was a heavy, wet sound. A ragged intake of breath that rattled deep in a massive chest, followed by a low whine that vibrated through the soles of her boots. Lyra froze, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Wolf. Every instinct drilled into her by her father screamed at her to run. Climb a tree. Hide. Draw the knife you keep in your boot. But the sound came again. A whimper of pure, unadulterated pain. It didn't sound like a monster plotting an ambush. It sounded like a creature accepting its end. Against all reason, Lyra took a step forward, then another. She pushed through a curtain of heavy ferns, the fronds weeping rainwater onto her sleeves. The terrain sloped downward, leading toward the mouth of the northern cave. It was a damp, shallow recess in the rock face, usually avoided because of the dripping stalactites and the smell of mold. Today, however, the smell of mold was overpowered by the metallic copper tang of blood. Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. Lying in the shadows of the cave was not a wolf. It was a mountain of fur and muscle. Even curled into a tight ball of misery, the creature was immense, easily twice the size of the gray wolves the hunters sometimes dragged back to the keep. But it was the color that arrested her breath. The fur was a brilliant, shimmering silver white, like moonlight trapped in physical form. Or it would have been, had the entire left flank not been matted with dark crimson stains. The creature's chest heaved with shallow, uneven breaths. A long, jagged gash tore across its shoulder, oozing fresh blood onto the stone floor. Lyra stood at the entrance, her legs trembling. This was a white wolf, a legend, a nightmare. Her father called them demons. The wolf's head snapped up. Lyra stopped breathing. Golden amber eyes locked onto hers. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a wild, terrifying haze of agony. The wolf let out a low growl, but the sound lacked the guttural threat of a predator. It was a plea for distance, a warning born of vulnerability. He tried to rise, his massive paws scrabbling against the stone, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed back with a pained huff. He was dying. The realization washed away Lyra's fear, replacing it with a strange warm tug in the center of her chest. It was an ache of sympathy so profound it almost hurt. She looked at the blood, so much blood, and felt a phantom sting on her own skin. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. Her voice shook, thin and reedy in the damp cave air. The wolf watched her, his ears pinned back against his skull. He watched her hands specifically, tracking their movement as if expecting a weapon. "I'm not a hunter," she said, stepping into the gloom of the cave. The air inside was colder, but a tremendous heat radiated from the beast's body. I want to help." She knelt 3 feet away from his muzzle. Up close, he was terrifyingly beautiful. The individual hairs of his coat were thick and lustrous where they weren't stained. He smelled of deep pine, rain, and something else. Something warm and sweet, like vanilla and wood smoke. It was a scent that defied the blood and dirt, a scent that made Lyra's shoulders drop an inch in relaxation. The wolf didn't take his eyes off her. He let out a soft chuff, his nose twitching as he inhaled her scent. He didn't bare his teeth. "I need to see the wound," Lyra murmured, moving with exaggerated slowness. She unbuckled her satchel. She didn't have hunter's tools, but she had her gathering kit. She pulled out a bundle of clean linen scraps she used for wrapping herbs, and a small jar of crushed marigold and honey she had prepared for her own scrapes. When she reached out, the wolf flinched. A rumble started in his chest, vibrating through the floor and into her knees. "Shh," she cooed, the way she might soothe a frightened horse. "It's okay. You're safe." She didn't know why she said that. A werewolf? Safe with a human? It was absurd. Yet, as her hand hovered inches from his neck, the growling stopped. The amber eyes softened, the pupils dilating. It was as if he was looking past her fear, seeing the intention in her soul. Lyra placed her hand on his neck. The contact was electric. A jolt, static and warm, zipped up her arm and settled at the base of her skull. It wasn't painful. It felt like coming home. The wolf let out a long breath, his heavy head drooping until his chin rested on his front paws. He leaned into her touch, just a fraction of an inch. A micro-movement of surrender. His fur was incredibly soft, softer than the finest velvet. Beneath it, she could feel the thrumming power of his muscles, tense with pain, but restrained. "You're burning up," she whispered, her fear dissolving into purpose. She worked quickly. The gash was deep, likely from a trap or a skirmish with another beast. She uncorked the jar of marigold salve. "This will sting," she warned softly. As she applied the paste, the wolf's body went rigid. His claws scraped against the rock, carving deep grooves into the stone. A whine escaped his throat, high and desperate. I know," Lyra hummed, her voice finding a melodic cadence without her realizing it. She began to clean the blood away with the linen, her touch feather-light. Just a moment more. Breathe. Just breathe. She wasn't just cleaning a wound. She was pouring her will into her fingertips. "Heal," she thought fiercely. "Please. Knit together. Stop hurting." Unbeknownst to Lyra, the gray of her eyes swirled with a faint momentary silver light. The blood on her hands didn't just wipe away. It seemed to absorb into the linen faster than physics should allow, leaving the skin beneath less angry, less inflamed. The wolf turned his head. He didn't snap. Instead, he nudged her arm with his wet nose. It was a clumsy, heavy gesture, asking for comfort. Lyra's heart squeezed. She abandoned the cleaning for a moment to bury both hands in the thick ruff of fur around his neck. She scratched gently behind his ear, and the massive beast let out a sound that was undeniably a purr. A deep, rhythmic thrumming that rattled in his chest like a saved engine. He was no longer the monster of her father's stories. He was a wounded soul seeking warmth. She finished binding the wound with her remaining strips of linen. It wasn't a professional job, but the bleeding had slowed significantly. The wolf seemed exhausted, his eyelids drooping. Lyra sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on the grass near the entrance. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. She had to leave. If she wasn't back before dark, Harkin would send search parties. "I have to go," she whispered, regret heavy in her voice. The wolf's eyes snapped open. He lifted his head, a low whine building in his throat. He looked at her with such intensity that Lyra felt pinned in place. He nudged her knee again, harder this time, and then rested his heavy head on her lap. The weight of him was grounding. He didn't want her to leave. "I can't stay," she said, her fingers involuntarily stroking the silky fur between his eyes. "But I will come back. Tomorrow." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the bamboo flute again. She didn't know why, but she felt she needed to leave something of herself behind, or perhaps just reassure him. "I promise," she said. She gently pushed his head off her lap. The wolf watched her stand, his amber eyes following her every movement. He didn't try to stop her, but his gaze felt like a tether, stretching tight as she backed out of the cave. As Lyra stepped back into the mist, leaving the warmth of the northern cave behind, she felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She touched her chest, right over her heart. It was beating a new rhythm, one that matched the heavy, steady thrum she had felt beneath the silver fur. She had touched the enemy. And God help her, she couldn't wait to do it again. Chapter 2. Flute Music Under the Moonlight. The day at Hunter's Keep passed with agonizing slowness. Every scrape of a sharpening stone, every bark of a hound, and every shout from the training grounds grated on Lyra's nerves. She moved through her chores like a ghost, her hands scrubbing floors and mending nets, but her spirit was anchored in the damp shadows of the northern cave. When the moon finally rose, fat and luminous against the indigo sky, Lyra slipped away. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth, hiding smoked venison she had pilfered from the pantry and a fresh flask of water. The walk to the buffer zone felt different tonight. The woods didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a corridor leading to a secret sanctum. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and the distant metallic chill of the Silver River. As she pushed aside the heavy ferns at the cave entrance, a low, rumbling sound greeted her. It wasn't a growl. It was a greeting. The giant white wolf was exactly where she had left him, though he had shifted his position to face the entrance. His amber eyes, glowing faintly in the gloom, locked onto her the moment she appeared. "I told you I'd come back," Lyra whispered, her breath hitching. She expected him to be lethargic, perhaps even worse off than yesterday. Instead, as she stepped inside, the wolf pushed himself up. His movements were still stiff, favoring his injured shoulder, but the trembling weakness was gone. He dragged his massive body across the stone floor toward her, his claws clicking rhythmically. Lyra froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was enormous. Standing, his head was nearly level with her chest. The sheer predatory power radiating from him should have terrified her. But then he did something that melted the ice in her veins. He lowered his head and pressed his wet, cold nose against her stomach, inhaling deeply. He let out a soft woof of air, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the cavern wall. Lyra let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Hello to you too," she murmured. She reached out, burying her fingers in the thick ruff of silver fur around his neck. He leaned into her touch immediately, his heavy body sagging against her legs for support. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a silent plea for closeness that made Lyra's chest ache with a sudden swelling of affection. "You're hungry," she said softly, pulling away gently to set down her basket. The wolf watched her with intense curiosity, his head cocked to the side. When she unwrapped the smoked venison, his ears perked up. He didn't snatch it. He waited until she held a piece out on her flat palm, then took it with surprising gentleness, his teeth barely grazing her skin. He ate voraciously, finishing the meat in moments, then lapped at the water she poured into a hollow depression in the rock. When he was finished, he didn't retreat to his corner. He came back to her, collapsing onto the floor at her feet and resting his chin on her boot. Lyra sat down on the cold stone, not caring about the dirt. She checked his bandages. The linen was stained, but the bleeding had stopped. When she peeled back the edge of the fabric to peek at the wound, she gasped softly. The angry, gaping gash from yesterday had knit together significantly. The edges were closing, the skin around it turning a healthy pink rather than an inflamed red. "You heal fast," she whispered, tracing the fur near the wound. The wolf rumbled, that deep, engine-like purr, and nudged her hand with his nose, pushing it up toward his ears. He wanted to be petted. Lyra laughed, a soft bell-like sound that seemed to bounce off the crystal-studded ceiling of the cave. "You're just a big baby, aren't you?" She spent the next hour simply existing with him. She stroked the velvet softness of his ears, ran her fingers through the coarse, thick fur of his back, and massaged the tension from his powerful shoulders. With every touch, the wolf seemed to melt further into the floor, his eyes closing, his breathing deepening into a rhythmic cadence that matched her own. The atmosphere in the cave shifted as the moon climbed higher. A beam of pure white moonlight found its way through a fissure in the rock above, creating a spotlight on the cave floor. The wolf suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled and a low whine built in his throat. His muscles bunched under Lyra's hand. "What is it?" Lyra asked, sensing the shift. "Does it hurt?" The wolf didn't answer. He couldn't. But his eyes were wide, the pupils blown black. He seemed restless, agitated by something unseen. It was the call of the moon, the ancient biological imperative that tugged at every lycanthrope's blood. The beast within him was waking up, stirred by the moonlight, wanting to run, to hunt, to howl. He clawed at the ground, a sharp growl escaping his lips. He looked at Lyra, then at the entrance, his body trembling with suppressed energy. He was fighting his own instincts to stay near her, but the battle was causing him distress. Lyra felt a wave of helplessness. She couldn't fight the moon, but she remembered her mother's words. "Play for the wind. They listen." Slowly, she reached into her tunic and pulled out the bamboo flute. The wolf's eyes snapped to the instrument. He watched as she raised it to her lips. Lyra closed her eyes and blew gently. The first note was a low, mournful sigh that echoed softly in the cavern. It wasn't a song she had learned from a book. It was a melody that lived in her blood, something she had heard her mother hum 1,000 times in her dreams. She played, and the sound was like liquid silver. It was the sound of rain falling on leaves, of wind whispering through high grass, of a mother's heartbeat heard from the womb. It was a lullaby for the wild things. At the first few notes, the wolf stiffened. He shook his head as if shaking off water. But as Lyra continued, finding the rhythm, weaving a tapestry of soft, ascending notes, the tension began to drain from him. The music seemed to take on a physical weight in the damp air. It swirled around them, pushing back the shadows. Lyra poured her empathy into the wood. "Peace," she projected with every breath. "Rest. You are safe here." The wolf's agitation ceased. He stopped clawing the earth. Slowly, he turned his massive head toward her, his amber eyes losing their frantic edge. They softened, becoming pools of molten gold. He crawled closer, dragging his body until he could lay his head in her lap. Lyra didn't stop playing. She felt the heavy weight of his skull against her thighs, the warmth of his breath penetrating her tunic. She played for him, her fingers dancing over the worn holes of the bamboo. And then, the magic happened. It started at the tips of his ears, A faint, pearlescent glow began to emanate from his silver fur. It wasn't a reflection of the moonlight, it was coming from within him. The light spread down his neck, washing over his shoulders, outlining his powerful form in a soft, ethereal halo. Lyra opened her eyes and faltered, missing a note in her surprise. The wolf let out a soft huff of protest at the interruption. Lyra resumed playing, her heart swelling with awe. The melody she played, the forbidden melody, was resonating with him. As the notes climbed higher, the glow pulsed in time with the music, growing brighter, warmer. The wound on his shoulder, hidden beneath the bandages, seemed to hum. Lyra could feel the heat of it through the fabric of his fur. It wasn't the heat of infection, but the heat of regeneration, accelerated, supercharged by the sound. The wolf closed his eyes, a look of sheer drugged bliss on his face. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his entire body going limp in her lap. The predatory edge was gone completely, replaced by a profound tranquility. Lyra played until her lungs burned and her fingers ached. She played until the moonbeam moved across the floor and faded. When she finally lowered the flute, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with connection. The wolf was asleep. His breathing was deep and even, the purring rumble now a soft snore. The glow faded slowly, leaving his fur looking glossier, healthier than it had any right to be. Lyra sat there in the dark, her hand resting on his head, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart against her leg. She knew she should go back. She was risking everything by being here. But looking down at the sleeping beast, at the way his paw was draped possessively over her ankle even in sleep, she knew she was already too deep. He wasn't just a wolf, and she wasn't just a hunter's daughter. "Good night," she whispered into the darkness, leaning down to press a daring, gentle kiss to the top of his velvet head. The wolf didn't wake, but his tail gave a single sleepy thump against the floor. Chapter 3. The Painful Transformation. The night of the full moon did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a scream of silence that stretched the air in the valley until it hummed. Lyra had known, logically, that the full moon affected werewolves. Her father's stories were filled with bloodthirsty beasts tearing through doors and hunting men for sport under the pale light. But nothing in Harkin's grim tales had prepared her for the reality of the northern cave that night. She had arrived just as twilight bled into true darkness, her chest tight with an unexplained anxiety. When she entered the cave, the air was already thick, charged with static electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The white wolf was not resting. He was pacing, a silver blur in the shadows. His claws struck sparks against the stone floor. He was panting, a harsh, rhythmic rasping that sounded like a saw cutting through wood. "I'm here," Lyra called out, her voice trembling slightly. The wolf spun around. His amber eyes were no longer soft pools of gold. They were burning coals, wild and unfocused. He snarled, a terrifying, guttural sound, but he didn't advance. Instead, he threw himself against the far wall of the cave, as if trying to put as much distance between them as possible. "Go!" his body language screamed. "Run!" But Lyra dropped her basket. She didn't run. She saw the way his muscles spasmed, rippling under the silver coat as if something was trying to escape from within. She saw the way he bit at his own flank, not in aggression, but in a desperate attempt to distract himself from a deeper pain. "No," she whispered, stepping forward. "I'm not leaving you." The moon crested the jagged peaks of the valley, and a shaft of pure, unadulterated moonlight pierced the cave entrance like a spear. It hit the crystals embedded in the ceiling, refracting into 1,000 dazzling shards of luminescence that rained down upon the wolf. He howled. It wasn't a call to the pack. It was a sound of absolute agony. His body arched, his spine bending at an impossible angle. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the cavern, wet, sharp pops that made Lyra's stomach turn. He collapsed to the floor, writhing, his paws scrabbling uselessly against the rock. "Stop!" Lyra cried, tears springing to her eyes. She rushed forward, disregarding the danger. She couldn't watch him suffer. She fell to her knees beside the thrashing beast. "Tell me what to do. How do I help?" The wolf's eyes met hers. In that split second, amidst the haze of pain, she saw recognition. He reached out a paw, his claws retracted, and touched her knee. And then, the silver fur began to recede. Lyra gasped, her hands hovering over him, terrified to touch, yet unable to pull away. The transformation was violent and beautiful, a chaotic dance of biology and magic. The snout shortened, the jaw realigning with a sickening crunch, the massive paws elongated, fingers unfurling. The silver tail vanished into the spine. Steam rose from his body, smelling of ozone, musk, and hot iron. The light from the crystals grew blindingly bright, wrapping him in a cocoon of energy that shielded the worst of the gore from her eyes. When the light faded, the wolf was gone. In his place lay a man. He was sprawled on his back, his chest heaving as if he had just run 100 miles. He was stark naked, his body a masterpiece of sculpted muscle and raw power, glistening with sweat that shone like oil in the moonlight. He was huge, tall and broad-shouldered, his limbs thick with strength. His hair was the color of midnight, damp and plastered to his forehead. Lyra stared, her breath caught in her throat. She should look away. A proper maiden of the keep would cover her eyes and flee, but she couldn't. Her gaze traced the long, jagged scar that ran diagonally across his chest, a pale line against his tanned skin. It was the same placement as the wolf's wound, but healed, ancient. The man groaned, a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated in Lyra's very bones. His eyelids fluttered open. The eyes were the same, sharp, burning amber. He stared up at the ceiling, blinking rapidly, his expression blank. The fierce intelligence of the wolf was there, but it was clouded by a profound confusion. He turned his head slowly and his gaze landed on Lyra. He didn't speak. He didn't ask who he was. He simply looked at her, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled. "You," he rasped. His voice was rough, unused, like gravel grinding together. He tried to sit up, but his arms trembled and gave way. He fell back with a hiss of frustration. The transition had drained him completely. Lyra's healer instincts overrode her shock. She quickly pulled off her outer cloak, a heavy woolen thing, and draped it over his lower half, preserving his modesty. "Lie still," she commanded softly, reaching out to brush a damp lock of black hair from his forehead. His skin was burning hot to the touch, radiating a feverish heat. At her touch, the man flinched, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was iron-strong, terrifyingly powerful. Lyra froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. But he didn't crush her bones. He held her wrist as if it were a lifeline, pulling her hand down until her palm rested against his cheek. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, letting out a long, broken sigh. "Soft," he murmured, the words slurring slightly. "Smells. Safe." "You're safe," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm Lyra. Do you know your name?" He opened his eyes again, brow furrowed. He looked searching, lost. "Name?" He tested the word, tasting it, then shook his head. "Pain. Just pain. Then you." Amnesia. The transformation had scrambled his mind. He was a blank slate, stripped of his history, his rank, his war. All that remained was the man and the wolf's instinct. And his instinct wanted her. He shifted, groaning as his muscles protested, and dragged himself closer to her until his head was resting in her lap, much like the wolf had done. The position was intimate, vulnerable. He curled into a ball, shivering violently as the adrenaline of the shift wore off, leaving the cold of the cave to seep into his bones. Cold, he whispered, his teeth chattering. Lyra didn't hesitate. She shifted her position, pulling his heavy upper body closer, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders to share her warmth. He was heavy, solid, and real, smelling of that intoxicating blend of vanilla, wood smoke, and rain, the scent of the forest after a storm. To soothe him, she began to hum. It was the melody from the night before. Without the flute, her voice was small and breathy, a fragile thread of sound in the darkness. But the effect was immediate. The man in her arms stopped shivering. He pressed his face into the crook of her neck, his nose brushing against the sensitive skin there. Lyra gasped, a flush rising on her cheeks, but she didn't pull away. He inhaled deeply, his breath hot and damp against her skin. Music, he mumbled against her neck, his voice vibrating against her pulse point. Light. You are the light. His hand, large and calloused, moved blindly until it found hers. He interlaced their fingers, his grip possessive, desperate. He squeezed her hand, not to hurt, but to ensure she was real. Don't go, he pleaded, his voice cracking. The alpha tone was gone. This was just a man terrified of the dark. I won't, Lyra promised, squeezing back. She rested her chin on the top of his head, rocking him gently. For a long time, they stayed like that. The fearsome beast, the enemy of her people, was now just a shivering man clinging to her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. And Lyra, the hunter's daughter, held him tight, feeling the steady, powerful thump of his heart against her own chest. She realized then, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that she wasn't just healing him. He was filling a hollow space in her soul she hadn't known existed. He nuzzled closer, his lips brushing the skin of her throat in a chaste, unconscious caress that sent shivers racing down her spine. Mine, he breathed, the word barely audible, spoken on the edge of sleep. Lyra's breath hitched. She looked down at his sleeping face, the harsh lines of pain smoothed away by the melody and her warmth. He looked young, almost peaceful. Sleep, she whispered, her heart swelling with a dangerous, forbidden tenderness. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, and the hunters in the keep sharpened their blades. But in the northern cave, under the watchful gaze of the crystals, a bond was forged that was stronger than steel and deeper than blood. The Alpha had found his melody. Chapter 4: Exposure and the Escape. Dawn broke with ruthless clarity, slicing through the protective gloom of the cave. Lyra woke with a start, the stiffness in her neck complaining about sleeping sitting up against a rock wall. But it was the warmth against her chest that truly woke her. The man, the wolf, was still asleep, his heavy head resting over her heart. In the pale morning light, stripped of the supernatural glow of the transformation, he looked devastatingly human. His features were strong, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his black eyelashes thick against his cheekbones. He was warm, so incredibly warm. Lyra's heart gave a painful lurch. Sunlight. She had stayed the entire night. Her father would be furious. The entire keep would be searching for her. She tried to ease out from under him, but his reaction was instantaneous. Before his eyes even opened, his arm tightened around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. A low rumble started in his throat, not quite a growl, but a possessive, sleepy vibration. "Stay," he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep, nuzzling into the woolen fabric of her tunic. "I can't," Lyra whispered, panic fluttering in her chest. She placed her hands on his broad shoulders, trying to create space. "You have to let me go. It's dangerous." His amber eyes blinked open, instantly alert. The confusion was still there, but it was overlaid with an intense focus on her face. Danger? Where? He sat up, the movement fluid and powerful, pulling the woolen cloak she'd lent him tighter around his waist. He scanned the cave entrance, his nostrils flaring, testing the air. It was then that Lyra heard it, the snap of a dry twig just outside the fern curtain. The heavy, deliberate crunch of iron-soled boots on stone. The blood drained from Lyra's face. She knew those footsteps. "Father," she breathed. Before she could move, the ferns were ripped aside with violent force. Harkin stood there, silhouetted against the morning light, his broad frame filling the entrance. He held his heavy yew bow, an arrow already nocked, the string drawn taut to his cheek. His eyes, usually so cold and disciplined, were wide with a mixture of relief and incandescent rage. He took in the scene in a heartbeat, the scattered blankets, his daughter disheveled on the floor, and the half-naked, powerful stranger looming over her. "Lyra," Harkin spat, his voice a low growl that rivaled any beast's. "Get away from him." The man beside Lyra didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the threat implied by the drawn weapon pointed at Lyra. With a speed that blurred the air, the man moved. He didn't retreat. He threw himself in front of Lyra, shielding her completely with his massive body. He dropped into a defensive crouch, a low snarl ripping from his throat. It wasn't the sound of a man, it was the warning of an apex predator protecting its mate. "No!" Lyra scrambled to her feet, grabbing the man's arm, trying to pull him back. "Don't hurt him. Father, stop." Harkin's face twisted in disgust. "You defend this savage? Look at him, Lyra. He smells of blood and beast." Harkin adjusted his aim, the arrowhead glinting dangerously, pointed straight at the man's broad chest. "Move, girl. I'll put the animal down." "He saved me." Lyra lied, desperation clawing at her throat. "I was attacked. He helped me." "By lying with you in a cave?" Harkin roared, his control snapping. The tension in the small space reached a breaking point. Harkin's finger twitched on the bowstring. Perhaps he meant to just wound the stranger, or perhaps his anger made him sloppy. The bowstring thrummed. The arrow flew. Lyra screamed. The man didn't even blink. He didn't try to dodge. He shifted his weight, turning his body to ensure the projectile wouldn't pass through him and hit Lyra behind him. The arrow struck his left shoulder with a sickening thud, burying itself deep in the muscle. The man grunted, staggering back a step, but he didn't fall. He looked down at the shaft protruding from his flesh with a kind of bewildered fury. Then he looked up at Harkin. The amber eyes burned with a sudden terrifying clarity. The confusion was gone, replaced by ancient primal rage. He threw his head back and roared. It was not a human shout. It was a sound that seemed to tear the air apart, a deep, resonant booming that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. It carried the weight of authority, of absolute dominance, an alpha's command that brooked no disobedience. Harkin, legendary hunter, killer of dozens of wolves, flinched. The primal sound hit his hunter instincts hard, freezing him in place for a crucial second, his blood running cold with ancestral fear. That second was all they needed. The man turned to Lyra, ignoring the arrow in his shoulder. His eyes were wild, pleading. "Run!" he rasped, grabbing her hand. His grip was iron, desperation fueling his strength. He pulled her toward the back of the cave, where a narrow fissure opened up to the outside cliff face. They burst out into the blinding morning sun. Below them, a 20-foot drop ended in the churning, sparkling waters of the Silver River. They were on the hunter's bank. Across the glittering divide lay the dark, dense forests of the werewolf territory. "Stop them!" Harkin's voice bellowed from inside the cave. "We have to jump!" Lyra gasped, looking down at the rushing water. She knew the legends. The water was freezing death to humans, worse to wolves. The man looked at the water, then back at the cave entrance where Harkin was emerging, drawing another arrow. He looked at Lyra, his eyes fierce with protective instinct. "Trust," he said, the single word heavy with meaning. He didn't give her time to argue. He wrapped his uninjured arm tight around her waist, pulling her against his side. He stepped to the edge of the cliff. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut and buried her face in his neck, inhaling the scent of pine and blood. They leaped. For a moment, they were weightless, suspended in the cool morning air between two worlds. Then, they hit the water. The cold was shocking, instantaneous. It stole the breath from Lyra's lungs like a physical blow. The current was violent, grabbing them and twisting them under the sparkling surface. Lyra struggled, her limbs heavy with cold, but the man's grip never wavered. He held her tight against him, kicking powerfully with his legs, fighting the current that sought to smash them against the rocks. Lyra opened her eyes underwater. The world was a chaotic swirl of silver bubbles and dark water. She looked at the man holding her. His eyes were open, burning gold in the murky depths. He wasn't drowning, he was fighting. As they were swept downstream, further and further from her father's furious shouts, Lyra realized two things. First, the water, while freezing, was not burning her skin as the legend said it would. And second, the man holding her, the beast her father had tried to kill, would sooner drown himself than let the river take her. Chapter 5: Beyond the Silver River. The world returned in a rush of noise and stinging cold. Lyra gasped, her lungs burning as she coughed up brackish water. She was lying on coarse, dark sand, the grit digging into her cheek. Her body felt heavy, waterlogged, her woolen tunic clinging to her skin like a second freezing skin. "Lyra." The voice was ragged, weak, but urgent. Hands, large and trembling, were on her shoulders, pulling her up. She blinked the river water from her eyes. The man, Kael, was hovering over her. He looked terrible. His lips were blue with cold, his skin pale beneath the tan, and the wound on his shoulder, where the arrow had struck, was oozing dark blood mixed with river water. Yet, his eyes were frantically scanning her face, searching for injuries. I'm okay," she wheezed, sitting up. They were on the other side. The mist here was different. On the hunter's bank, the fog was white and cold. Here, on the werewolf's bank, the mist seemed to have a faint pearlescent sheen, swirling with a life of its own. The trees were massive, their roots gnarled and twisting like frozen snakes. The canopy so dense it blocked out the midday sun, casting everything in a perpetual, twilight gloom. Kyle slumped back onto the sand once he was sure she was breathing. He hissed in pain, clutching his shoulder. The Silver River, notorious for burning the skin of werewolves like acid, had left angry, red welts across his torso where the water had soaked him. But he wasn't melting. He was alive. "You held me?" he rasped, looking at his own hands, then at her. "The water. It bit. But where you touched, it was cool." Lyra looked at her hands, her silver blood. The legends were true. She was a conduit, a shield. "We can't stay here," Lyra whispered, shivering as the wind cut through her wet clothes. "My father. He won't cross the river, but his arrows can reach far." Kael nodded. He forced himself to stand, swaying dangerously. He reached down and pulled Lyra to her feet. Even in his weakened state, his instinct was to keep her close, tucking her under his uninjured arm. They stumbled into the tree line, moving deeper into the forbidden territory. The forest was silent, too silent. There were no birds, no rustling squirrels, just the dripping of condensation from the leaves and the labored sound of their own breathing. Kael paused suddenly, his body going rigid against hers. He lifted his head, sniffing the air. A low, vibrating growl built in his chest, a warning. "What is it?" Lyra whispered. Eyes, he murmured. Many eyes. Before Lyra could react, the shadows detached themselves from the trees. Wolves, a dozen of them. They were gray and brown, smaller than Kael's white wolf form but still formidable. They moved with coordinated, lethal grace, encircling them in seconds. Their lips were curled back, exposing yellowed fangs, and low snarls rippled through the circle. Lyra's hand went to the small knife in her boot, but Kael stopped her. He stepped in front of her, despite his injuries. He didn't cower. He stood to his full height, blood dripping down his arm, and let out a roar. It was weaker than the one in the cave, but it still carried that strange, resonant authority. Back down. The wolves faltered. Their ears twitched. They sensed the power, the alpha aura that even amnesia couldn't fully erase. Some of them lowered their tails, confused. Then, the circle parted. A man stepped through the ranks of the wolves. He was clad in dark leather armor, a fur cloak draped over his shoulders. He was lean, with a sharp, angular face and eyes the color of flint. His movements were fluid, too smooth, like oil sliding over glass. This was Vorian. He stopped 10 paces away, his gaze sweeping over the trembling, half-drowned couple. When his eyes landed on Kael, Lyra saw a flicker of something dangerous. Shock, quickly masked by a sneer of calculation. Well, well, Vorian said, his voice smooth and sibilant. What do we have here? Refuse washed up from the human side? Kael growled, the sound deep and threatening. Stay back. Vorian tilted his head, studying Kael with a mockingly pitying expression. You look familiar, stranger, like a ghost of someone important. But ghosts don't bleed, do they? Vorian's gaze flicked to the wolves around him. He saw their hesitation, their instinctual submission to Kael's presence. He knew he had to act fast. If the pack realized who this was, that their lost king had returned, his own ambitions would be crushed. This man, Vorian announced loudly, pitching his voice to carry to the encircling wolves, bears the scent of the hunter's keep. And the woman, she smells of the hunter Harkin himself. A ripple of angry snarls went through the pack. Harkin was a name of death to them. He is no hunter, Lyra cried out, stepping out from behind Kael. He is one of you. Look at him. Vorian's eyes snapped to her, cold and dead. I see a traitorous beast who consorts with humans, and I see a human spy. He sniffed the air theatrically. And he carries the stench of disease. Look at his skin, burned by the river. Look at his madness. He is sick, Lyra pleaded. He needs help. Precisely. Vorian smiled, a thin, cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes. We cannot risk the pack's safety. These two are intruders, likely carrying the pathogens that the hunters use to poison our waters. He raised a hand. Seize them. Take them to the dungeon beneath the crystal cavern. If they resist, tear their throats out. Kael lunged, a desperate attempt to protect Lyra, but he was too weak. 2 large wolves sprang, slamming into him, pinning him to the damp earth. He roared, thrashing, but the exhaustion and the blood loss finally claimed him. His head lolled back, his eyes rolling up. Kael! Lyra screamed, struggling as rough hands grabbed her arms. Kael! Vorian tested the name, stepping closer to the unconscious man. He leaned down, whispering so only the wind could hear. So you remember nothing, my king? Good. Then you will die a nameless dog. The dungeon was not a cage of iron bars. It was a pit hewn into the living rock beneath the mountains. It smelled of damp stone, old fear, and darkness. They were thrown in together, landing on a pile of moldy straw. The heavy wooden grate above them slammed shut, plunging them into near-total darkness, save for a single shaft of dim light filtering from a crack high above. Lyra crawled immediately to Kael. He was shivering violently now, his skin burning with fever. The arrow wound was inflamed, and the river burns were blistering. "I'm here," she whispered, her hands trembling as she smoothed the wet hair from his forehead. "I'm here, Kael." He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. In the dark, the amber irises seemed dull, glazed over with pain. "Cold," he muttered. "So cold." "I know," Lyra choked out. She looked around the cell. There was nothing. No blankets, no water, no medicine. She did the only thing she could. She lay down beside him on the dirty straw, pulling his heavy body against hers. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing her front to his back, trying to transfer every ounce of her body heat into him. "You're warm," he mumbled, his hand clumsily finding hers where it rested on his chest. He laced their fingers together, holding on tight. "I've got you," she whispered into his ear. "I won't let you fade." Kael shifted, turning painfully until he was facing her. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent. Vanilla and rain, the only anchor he had left in this nightmare. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why? Help." "Monster?" Lyra's heart broke. She tightened her hold on him, her hand stroking the back of his head. "You're not a monster," she said fiercely. "You saved me. You protected me. And I think my soul knows yours." It was a bold admission, one she barely understood herself. But in the dark, with the weight of the mountain pressing down on them, the truth was the only thing that mattered. Kael let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension in his body began to unspool, not from healing, but from the comfort of her presence. He nuzzled against her collarbone, his lips brushing her skin. "Lyra," he breathed. "My Lyra." He fell into a fitful sleep, his breathing ragged. Lyra stayed awake, staring up at the darkness. She listened to the drip of water somewhere in the distance. She felt the heat of his fever and the strength of his grip on her hand. They were prisoners. They were in the heart of enemy territory. The man who ruled this place wanted them dead. But as Lyra held the fallen king in her arms, feeling the faint rhythmic thrumming of his inner wolf trying to purr despite the pain, she knew one thing for certain. They might die here, but they would not die alone. She closed her eyes, and in the silence of the dungeon, she began to hum the forbidden melody. Softly, barely a breath, filling the space between them with a fragile, shimmering hope. Chapter 6. Deal with the Devil. The dungeon air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and Kael's rising fever. For hours, or perhaps days, it was hard to tell in the subterranean gloom, Lyra had done nothing but hold him. She wiped the sweat from his brow with her sleeve and whispered stories of the forest to keep him tethered to reality. The heavy grate above them groaned open, sending a shower of dust and rust down onto the straw. "Up!" a rough voice commanded. "Vorian demands your presence." 2 guards dropped a rope ladder. Lyra helped Kael stand. He was burning up, his skin radiating a terrifying heat, but as soon as the guard's scent hit his nose, a low rumble vibrated in his chest. He pushed Lyra behind him, his amber eyes glassy but fierce. Even dying, he was shielding her. They were hauled up and marched through the twisting tunnels of the crystal cavern. The natural beauty of the place was undeniable. Quartz crystals the size of tree trunks jutted from the walls, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. But the atmosphere was choked with misery. Instead of a throne room, they were led to a vast, hollowed-out chamber that smelled of sickness. It was a makeshift infirmary. Lyra's healer instincts flared instantly. The air here was thick with the scent of rotting meat and sour sweat. Dozens of wolves lay on furs scattered across the stone floor. They weren't just injured, they were withering. Their fur was falling out in clumps, revealing gray, ashen skin marked by black veins that pulsed like living worms. Whimpers filled the air, high, keening sounds of distress that tore at Lyra's heart. Kael stiffened beside her. He didn't remember these people, didn't remember being their king, but his body remembered. His head whipped from side to side, taking in the suffering of the pack. A sound of pure distress escaped his throat, a sharp whine that cut through the groans of the sick. "What is this?" Lyra whispered, horrified. "This," Vorian's smooth voice answered, "is the shadow plague." The beta stood in the center of the room, flanked by 4 imposing guards. He looked pristine, untouched by the squalor around him. He gestured to the dying wolves with a feigned solemnity. "It began 3 moons ago," Vorian said, his eyes drilling into Kael. "I'd a curse that rots the body from the inside. We have tried herbs, magic, prayer. Nothing works. And now..." He pointed a gloved finger at Lyra. "You arrive. A human." And suddenly, the sickness spikes. A murmur of anger went through the room. Even the sick wolves lifted their heads, baring teeth at Lyra. "That's a lie." Lyra stepped forward, her fear momentarily eclipsed by indignation. "We just got here. This sickness, it's old. I can smell the decay." Vorian smiled, a razor-thin expression. "And what does a hunter's daughter know of wolf ailments, unless she brought the poison herself?" He turned to the guards. "Take them to the execution rock. We will offer their blood to the spirits. Perhaps that will lift the curse." "No!" Kael roared. He lunged forward, breaking the grip of the guards holding him. He staggered, nearly falling, but managed to stay upright, swaying between Lyra and Vorian. "Take me. Let her go." Vorian laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "How noble, and how pathetic. You can barely stand, Alpha." Lyra looked at the wolves on the floor. She looked at a young female near her feet, whose breathing was a wet rattle. She saw the black veins creeping up the wolf's neck toward her heart. She recognized the energy. It wasn't a virus. It was dark magic. It was the same shadowy coldness she felt radiating off Vorian, though he hid it well. "I can save them," Lyra said. Her voice was quiet, but in the sudden silence of the cavern it rang like a bell. Vorian froze. He turned back to her slowly. "What did you say?" "I can save them," Lyra repeated, louder this time. She stepped out from behind Kael's protective bulk. "I am a healer. My mother. She taught me things your shamans don't know." Vorian narrowed his eyes. He walked toward her, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive spices and cold steel. "You claim you can cure the shadow plague? A curse that has baffled our elders?" "I claim I can try," Lyra said, holding his gaze. She didn't mention the silver blood. She didn't mention the flute. She just let her certainty shine through. "If I fail, you can kill me. You lose nothing." Vorian studied her. His mind worked rapidly behind those flinty eyes. He was the one who had cast the curse, using a dark artifact he had stolen from the Hunter archives years ago. It was designed to weaken the families loyal to Kael, paving the way for his own ascension. There was no cure, not that he knew of. If he killed them now, he would be a hero. But if he let this human girl try and fail, he could humiliate Kael further. He could prove that Kael's mate was a fraud, a charlatan who gave false hope to the dying. The despair of the pack would be absolute, and their loyalty to Vorian would be cemented by their collective grief. "A wager," Vorian said softly, his voice silky. "Interesting." He turned to the room, spreading his arms wide. "Did you hear that, brothers and sisters? The human claims she can heal you. The hunter's daughter wants to play doctor." A few weak growls answered him, but mostly there was silence. Desperate eyes watched Lyra. Hope, however fragile, was a powerful thing. "I will give you until moonrise tomorrow," Vorian declared. "Cure the pup." He pointed to a small emaciated wolf in the corner, a juvenile, barely clinging to life. The black veins had already reached its eyes. It was a death sentence, Vorian knew the pup wouldn't last the hour. If the pup lives and the black veins recede, Vorian continued, I will spare your lives. For now. If the pup dies, you both die. Slowly. Deal, Lyra said instantly. Lyra, no, Kael rasped, grabbing her wrist. His grip was weak, his hand burning. He is tricking you. Lyra covered his hand with hers, squeezing gently. She looked up into his fever-bright eyes. I have to try, Kael. Look at them. She turned to Vorian. I need my satchel. And I need my flute. Vorian raised an eyebrow. The flute? Are you going to entertain the dying? Music is medicine, Lyra said simply. Vorian chuckled darkly. Give her the bag. And the stick. Let us see this miracle. The guards tossed her leather satchel and the bamboo flute at her feet. You have the corner, Vorian sneered. Do not try to leave. He swept out of the room, his cape billowing behind him, taking most of the guards with him. He left only 2 at the door, confident that the sick wolves and the weakened alpha were no threat. Lyra wasted no time. She hurried to the dying pup. Up close, the smell of the curse was pungent, like sulfur and old grave dirt. The little wolf whined, its body trembling with spasms. Kael dragged himself over, collapsing beside Lyra. He didn't have the strength to help, so he did the only thing he could. He curled his body around the pup and Lyra, creating a physical barrier between them and the rest of the room. He rested his chin on his paws, watching Lyra's hands with intense, unwavering focus. It hurts him, Kael whispered, looking at the pup. Make it stop. I will, Lyra said, her voice trembling slightly. She opened her satchel. She had her herbs. Yes, but herbs wouldn't fix this. This was magic. She looked at her hands. Her skin was pale, unblemished. Underneath flowed the silver blood, the legacy of a mother she barely knew. And in her pocket was the flute. She took out a small knife from her kit. What doing? Kael asked, his eyes widening as he saw the blade. Trust me, Lyra whispered. She didn't cut herself yet. First, she needed to prepare the vessel. She picked up the flute. It felt warm in her hand, humming slightly as if it recognized the danger. She began to play. It wasn't the lullaby she had played for Kael. This was different. It was a searching melody, low and probing. She directed the sound toward the pup. As the notes drifted through the stagnant air, the reaction was immediate. The black veins on the pup's skin seemed to squirm, agitated by the pure sound. The pup yelped in pain. Kael flinched, a low growl building in his throat, but he didn't stop her. He sensed the intent. The music was fighting the darkness. It's deep, Lyra murmured, lowering the flute. The music alone isn't enough. It needs a bridge. She looked at Kael. I need you to hold him down, gently. Kael placed a large, heavy paw over the pup's trembling legs. I hold. Lyra took a deep breath. She looked at the knife, then at the pup's open mouth, panting with shallow breaths. She couldn't force the pup to drink her blood directly. It might be too strong. She needed to mix it. Water, she requested. Kael nudged a wooden bowl of water toward her with his nose. Lyra held her left hand over the bowl. With a steady hand, she drew the knife across her palm. A thin line of crimson welled up. But as it dripped into the water, it didn't dissolve into red. It swirled like mercury, silver filaments dancing in the liquid. The scent that filled the air was not metallic. It was sweet, overpowering the smell of rot. It smelled of life itself, of blooming wildflowers and clean snow. Every wolf in the room lifted their head. Kael's eyes went wide. He stared at the blood, his nostrils flaring. The scent seemed to drug him, his eyelids drooping, the pain in his face relaxing. Drink, Lyra whispered, lifting the bowl to the pup's muzzle. The pup resisted at first, But as the silver-scented water touched its tongue, it began to lap frantically. Lyra picked up the flute again. Now, she thought, amplify it. She played one-handed, her bleeding hand wrapped around the bamboo, staining the wood. The blood didn't make the instrument slippery, it seemed to soak into the grain. When she blew, the sound that came out was visible. A ripple of silver light, like a sound wave made of starlight, washed over the pup. The combination of the silver blood internally and the forbidden melody externally created a resonance. The black veins didn't just recede, they burned away. Smoke rose from the pup's skin, gray, hissing smoke that vanished into the air. The pup's body arched, a final spasm of expulsion, and then it went still. Silence stretched in the infirmary. Then, the pup took a deep, clear breath. It opened its eyes. The milky haze was gone. They were bright, clear blue. It looked at Lyra, gave a small yip, and licked the remaining blood from her hand. By the moon, a voice whispered from the darkness of the room. One by one, the other sick wolves began to drag themselves toward Lyra. They didn't attack. They didn't growl. They crawled on their bellies, whining, begging. Lyra looked at Kael. He was staring at her with an expression of absolute awe, bordering on worship. You, he whispered, pressing his forehead against her shoulder. You are miracle. But Lyra felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The magic had a cost. She swayed, and Kael caught her, pulling her into his lap. Rest, he commanded softly, licking the cut on her palm. His tongue was rough and warm, and where he licked, the stinging stopped. I watch now. She had won the wager. But as she looked at the dozens of other wolves waiting for salvation, she knew the real battle had just begun. Vorian wouldn't be pleased with a miracle. He would be terrified. Chapter 7. The Saving Blood and Blood Oath. The silence in the infirmary was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of death. It was the breathless hush of reverence. The wolf pup, previously knocking on death's door, was now bounding around Lyra's feet, yipping with a vitality that seemed impossible. The black veins had vanished, leaving only clean, soft gray fur. Lyra slumped against the cold stone wall, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Her left hand throbbed where she had cut it, the wound already knitting together sluggishly, a side effect of her own blood's potency perhaps, or just the magic demanding its price. Lyra. The voice was a cracked ruin. Kael had not moved. He was still curled around her legs, his body a massive fever-hot barricade between her and the world. But his head was heavy on her thigh, and his breathing was shallow and wet. She looked down, and her heart stopped. While she had been focused on the pup, Kael had been quietly fighting a losing battle. The shadow plague, opportunistic and cruel, had latched onto his weakened state, battered by the arrow, burned by the river, and drained by the transformation. The black veins were there, creeping up his neck like spiderwebs made of ink, pulsing in time with his erratic heartbeat. No, Lyra gasped, scrambling to turn fully toward him. She cupped his face. He was burning, his skin dry and papery. His amber eyes were half open, but they weren't looking at her. They were wandering, lost in a fog of delirium. Dark, he mumbled, his teeth chattering. So dark. Can't find the path. I'm here, Kael. Look at me, Lyra commanded, her voice breaking. She reached for her water bowl, but it was empty. She looked at the other wolves. They were watching with wide, expectant eyes. They needed her too. But if she lost him? If the light in those amber eyes went out? The thought paralyzed her with a terror she had never known. Water! She croaked to the guards at the door. The guards didn't move. They were staring at the healed pup, terrified and confused. They didn't know whether to follow Vorian's orders or bow to the miracle worker. Get her water! A rasping voice barked from the floor. It was an elder wolf, one of the sickest. Do it! One guard, shaken, hurried to a bucket and refilled the bowl, sliding it across the floor. Lyra grabbed it. She didn't have time for the flute. She didn't have time to dilute it properly. The darkness was moving too fast. She could see the veins reaching for Kael's jawline. She took the knife. Her hand trembled. Don't, Kael whispered. He seemed to have a moment of lucidity, his eyes focusing on the blade. He tried to push her hand away, his touch weak and clumsy. Too much. Blood. You. Weak. I have enough, Lyra said fiercely. I have enough for you. She didn't cut her palm this time. She made a small incision on her wrist, right over the pulse point where the blood flowed strongest and hottest. The crimson liquid welled up, rich and laced with that telltale silver shimmer. The scent hit the air instantly, intoxicating, sweet, like crushed vanilla beans and ozone. She didn't mix it with the water. She pressed her wrist directly to Kael's lips. Drink, she ordered softly. Please, Kael. Drink. Me. He resisted for a heartbeat, his instinct to protect her warring with the biological imperative of the starving beast. But the scent was overwhelming. It called to the wolf, promising life, promising power. He opened his mouth. When his tongue touched her skin, a jolt of electricity arced through Lyra so powerful she gasped aloud. It wasn't pain. It was a connection so sudden and absolute, it felt like a door slamming shut and locking forever. Kael groaned, a sound deep in his chest. He began to drink. It wasn't the frantic feeding of a predator. It was desperate, yes, but reverent. His tongue lapped at the wound, cleaning the blood as it flowed. With every swallow, Lyra felt a tug in her navel, a physical sensation of her life force pouring into him, and he felt it too. Kael's eyes snapped wide open. The amber iris was suddenly swallowed by a ring of brilliant, glowing silver. The reaction was violent. His back arched, his muscles seizing. The shadow plague fought back. The black veins writhed under his skin, visible and angry, battling the silver fire that was now rushing through his veins. It hurts, he gasped, pulling away from her wrist, clutching his chest. Lyra, it burns. It's the healing, she cried, pulling him into her arms, rocking him. It's burning the sickness. Hold on, just hold on. He buried his face in her neck, his body shaking with tremors. He was hallucinating now, the fever breaking in a storm of memory and emotion. I see. Snow, he rambled, his voice thick with tears. I see the white wolf. He is lonely. He runs and runs, but the snow never ends. Lyra realized he was seeing his own soul, the isolation of the alpha, the burden of the crown he couldn't remember wearing. You're not alone, she whispered, stroking his sweat-drenched hair. The snow is gone. No, he sobbed, a sound so broken it shattered Lyra's composure. The silence. The silence is so loud, it eats me. He was fighting the darkness in his mind just as his body fought the poison. He needed an anchor. Lyra reached for the flute with her free hand. She couldn't play it properly with one hand, but she didn't need a symphony. She just needed a sound. She brought the bamboo to her lips and blew a single, long, wavering note. Then another. She began to play the forbidden melody, but she changed the tempo. She made it faster, brighter, a heartbeat, a marching rhythm, a promise of morning. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound wrapped around Kael. He went still. The tremors ceased. He lifted his head slowly. The black veins on his neck were fading, dissolving into mist just as they had on the pup. The color was returning to his face, not just the flush of fever, but the healthy bronze of life. But it was his eyes that held her. They were no longer glazed. They were clear, sharp, and filled with an emotion so intense it terrified her. It was a look of total, devastating recognition. He looked at the flute in her hand, then at the cut on her wrist which had stopped bleeding, leaving a faint silver scar. He reached out and took her hand, the one with the cut. He brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss not to the wound, but to her palm. "I hear it," he whispered. His voice was no longer a rasp, it was the deep velvet baritone of the king. "Hear what?" Lyra breathed. "The song," Kael said. He placed her hand against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating strong and steady, a powerful drum in the quiet cave. It was always there, in the silence. I just couldn't hear it until you. He sat up, his movements fluid and strong. The weakness was gone. The silver blood hadn't just healed him, it had supercharged him. He loomed over her, blocking out the light, the cave, the guards. "Lyra," he said, savoring her name. "Yes?" He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His breath smelled of the silver blood, sweet and clean. "Don't sing sad songs anymore," he whispered, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I will wake up. I am awake now." It was a promise. It was an oath. He didn't need to sign a paper. He didn't need a ceremony. The blood they had shared had bound them. She could feel him in the back of her mind, a warm, golden presence that felt like the sun breaking through fog. She could feel his protectiveness, his awe, and a fierce, terrifying love that had taken root in the span of a few heartbeats. "Mate." His inner wolf purred, the sound vibrating through the bond. "Mine. Life." Lyra dropped the flute. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in the crook of his shoulder. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice muffled against his skin. Kael growled, a soft, rumbling sound of comfort. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her easily until she was sitting in his lap, cocooned entirely by his strength. "Never again," he vowed into her hair. "I have you. I have the blood. I have the melody." He looked up, over her shoulder, at the two guards. The guards shrank back. They weren't looking at a sick prisoner anymore. They were looking at an alpha in his prime, radiating an aura of power that made the air shimmer. His eyes glowed with a faint silver rim, the mark of the connection. "Open the door," Kael said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The command was absolute. The guards hesitated, then scrambled to obey. "We aren't leaving," Lyra whispered, pulling back to look at him. "The others. We have to help them." Kael looked at the room full of sick wolves. His instinct was to take Lyra and run, to hide her away where Vorian couldn't touch her. But he felt the tug of her heart. She wanted to save them. And because she wanted it, he would move mountains to make it happen. "Then we save them," Kael said, standing up and lifting Lyra effortlessly into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He set her down gently near the next patient. "Play, my heart," he said, standing guard over her, his back broad and unyielding. "I will be your shield." As Lyra raised the flute again, she knew that everything had changed. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a force of nature. And the silver blood that ran through her veins now ran through his, binding them together in a knot that neither time nor death could untie. Chapter 8: The Return of the King. The infirmary had transformed. What was once a waiting room for death was now a sanctuary of quiet breathing and restful sleep. Lyra sat on a wooden stool, her flute resting in her lap, her head leaning back against the rough stone wall. She was exhausted, drained to the marrow, but her heart felt light. Every wolf in the room had been treated. The silver water, amplified by the melody, had done its work. Kael stood by the heavy oak doors, his arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't left her side for a second, pacing like a sentinel whenever she moved, his eyes tracking her every breath. The healed wolves watched him with a mixture of fear and instinctive submission. They didn't know he was their missing king. Not yet. But their inner wolves recognized the power radiating from him. It was a pressure in the air, dense and electric, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The silence was broken by the heavy thud of boots. The doors swung open, banging against the stone walls. Vorian strode in, expecting silence, expecting corpses. He was followed by his elite guard, 6 wolves in human form, heavily armed. Vorian stopped dead. He stared at the pup, who was sleeping peacefully at Lyra's feet. He stared at the elder wolf, who was sitting up, grooming his restored fur. He stared at the lack of black veins, the lack of the stench of rot. His face, usually a mask of oily composure, cracked. For a fleeting second, Lyra saw naked panic. Impossible, Vorian hissed. He turned his gaze to Lyra. She met his eyes, tired but defiant. Kael stepped forward, moving silently to place himself between Lyra and the beta. "The wager is won," Kael rumbled. His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. The low, vibrating warning of a predator who has stopped playing. Vorian's eyes narrowed. He looked at Kael, at the healed skin, the powerful stance, the faint silver glow that still lingered in his irises. Vorian realized with a jolt of terror that his plan had backfired. He hadn't just given them a chance to fail, he had given them the stage to become legends. If Lyra walked out of here, the pack would worship her. And Kael. Kael was looking less like a confused stray and more like a threat every second. "Sorcery," Vorian spat, his voice rising. "This isn't healing, this is necromancy. She has bewitched them." He drew his sword, a curved blade of dark steel. "The human is a witch. She has infected the pack with a new curse to hide the old one. Kill her." The guards hesitated. They looked at the healed wolves, then at Lyra. "I said kill her!" Vorian screamed, his control shattering. He lunged forward himself, the blade aiming not for Kael, but for Lyra, hoping to cut the head off the snake. Time seemed to slow. Lyra saw the blade. She saw the malice in Vorian's eyes. But she didn't feel fear. She felt a sudden, sharp tug in her chest. The bond. Mine. The roar didn't come from Kael's throat. It came from his soul. Kael moved faster than thought. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. He caught Vorian's wrist in midair. The sound of the impact was like a hammer striking an anvil. Vorian gasped, his eyes bulging as Kael's grip tightened. Bone creaked. Kael stepped in close, invading Vorian's space. He looked down at his former beta, and in that moment, the last lock in Kael's mind shattered. The sight of the traitor raising a blade against his mate burned away the fog of amnesia instantly. He remembered the ambush. He remembered the poison in his wine. He remembered Vorian's smiling face as he pushed Kael off the cliff into the Silver River. "Vorian," Kael said. The name wasn't a question anymore. It was a judgment. Kael twisted his wrist, and Vorian shrieked as he was forced to his knees. The sword clattered to the floor. "You!" Vorian gasped, looking up into amber eyes that were now burning with the full, terrifying intelligence of the king. "You remember." "I remember everything," Kael said coldly. He released Vorian's wrist only to grab him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one hand. Kael turned to the room, to the guards who were frozen in shock. "He poisoned you!" Kael's voice boomed, filling the cavern, shaking the dust from the crystals above. There was no curse. There was only his ambition. He poisoned the water. He poisoned me. And he tried to kill the only one who could save you. He threw Vorian across the room. The beta crashed into a table of supplies, shattering jars and sending herbs flying. Vorian scrambled up, coughing, clutching his throat. "He lies. He is mad. I am your alpha now." Vorian's eyes flashed and he shifted. His clothes shredded as he transformed into a large, dark gray wolf. He snarled, snapping his jaws, trying to assert dominance, trying to cow the room with his alpha aura, but it was like a candle trying to outshine the sun. Kael didn't shift. He didn't have to. He simply unleashed the pressure he had been holding back. The true alpha aura exploded outward. It was a physical wave of dominance. It wasn't fear. It was gravity. It forced every wolf in the room to lower their heads. The guards dropped to their knees, their instincts screaming at them to submit. Kael walked toward the snarling gray wolf. With every step, Vorian shrank back. Kael's presence was suffocating, absolute. "You are no alpha," Kael said softly. "You are a shadow." Vorian whined. The pressure was crushing him. He couldn't attack. He couldn't even stand. He collapsed onto his belly, exposing his throat in the ultimate sign of submission. Kael stopped. He looked at the traitor with disgust, then turned his back on him. He walked straight to Lyra. The room was silent. All eyes were on them. Lyra stood up, her heart racing. Kael looked different. He was no longer the lost wanderer she had found in the cave. He was regal, terrifying, and magnificent. "Kael," she whispered. He cupped her face with both hands. His touch was trembling, not with weakness, but with the intensity of his emotion. "I am Kael," he said, his thumb brushing her lip. "I am the king of the silver blood. And you?" He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You are my savior. You are my melody." He turned his head slightly, baring his teeth. He didn't bite her to hurt. He grazed the sensitive skin where her neck met her shoulder. It was a public claim, a declaration. "I mark you," he whispered against her skin, the words vibrating through her. "Before the pack, before the moon. You are my queen, my fated mate." He pressed a kiss to the spot, searing it with his intent. A collective gasp went through the room. The guards, the healed wolves, everyone bowed their heads, not in fear, but in recognition. They weren't just bowing to Kael, they were bowing to Lyra. Vorian saw this. From his prone position on the floor, he saw his power evaporate. He saw the pack he had tried to steal, pledging loyalty to the man he had failed to kill and the woman he had underestimated. Hatred, cold and sharp, overcame his fear. If he couldn't have the pack, he would burn the valley down. While all eyes were on the emotional reunion of the king and queen, Vorian scrambled backward. He didn't shift back to human form. He bolted. He moved like a streak of dark smoke, scrambling out the open door and into the labyrinthine tunnels of the cavern. "Stop him!" a guard shouted. Kael lifted his head, his eyes tracking the fleeing traitor. He could have chased him down. He could have ended it then and there. But Lyra swayed in his arms, the exhaustion finally taking its toll. Kael prioritized. "Let him run," Kael growled, pulling Lyra closer to his chest. "A shadow cannot survive in the light. He has nowhere to go but to his enemies." He turned to the guards, his voice ringing with command. "Secure the cavern, tend to the recovering. Today, the Silver Blood Pack is reborn." As Kael lifted Lyra into his arms to carry her out of the infirmary toward the royal quarters, Lyra rested her head on his shoulder. She listened to the steady, powerful beat of his heart, the heart of a king. "He's going to my father," Lyra whispered, a cold dread settling in her stomach. "He's going to the hunters." Kael kissed the top of her head. "Let him. We will face them together. You are not just a hunter's daughter anymore, Lyra. You are the Alpha's heart." Chapter 9. The Shadow Alliance and Sacrifice. The fog surrounding Hunter's Keep was usually a comfort to hearken, a cold, damp wall that kept the nightmares at bay. But tonight, the mist felt suffocating. It had been 2 days since Lyra had vanished, 2 days since he had seen her leap into the icy embrace of the Silver River with a monster. He sat by the hearth, sharpening a broadhead arrow with mechanical, terrifying precision. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The heavy oak doors of the keep creaked open. The guards didn't shout a challenge, they sounded confused. Harkin looked up, his eyes narrowed. A man stumbled into the hall. He was wet, shivering, and wrapped in a tattered gray cloak. He fell to his knees before the fire, coughing violently. "Help!" the man rasped. The girl." Harkin was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room in 2 strides. He grabbed the stranger by the collar, hauling him up. "What girl? Speak!" The stranger looked up. It was Vorian, though Harkin did not know his name or his rank. He only saw a man who looked like he had escaped hell. Vorian's face was a mask of calculated terror. "The healer," Vorian lied, his voice trembling with feigned exhaustion. "The one with the flute, the white wolf. He has her." "Is she alive?" Harkin demanded, shaking him. "Barely," Vorian whispered, planting the poison in Harkin's ear. "He is using her blood. He is draining her to feed his power. I tried to stop him. I tried." He showed a fresh, self-inflicted gash on his arm. "He is a demon. He plans to sacrifice her tonight at the Crystal Cavern to break the barrier to your world." Harkin released him, his face draining of color, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. The image of his Lyra, his gentle, musical Lyra, being bled dry by that silver beast shattered his restraint. "Sound the horn," Harkin commanded, his voice low and deadly. He turned to his lieutenant. "Gather every man. Bring fire. Bring the iron nets. We go to the cavern." Vorian, slumped on the floor, hid a smile behind his hand. Dance, puppets, dance. The Crystal Cavern was usually a place of serenity, but tonight, the air was brittle with tension. Kael stood at the entrance, his arm draped possessively around Lyra's shoulders. He could smell them before he saw them, the scent of oil, iron, and hatred rolling up the valley like a storm front. "They are coming," Kael murmured, his nose twitching. Lyra gripped his hand tighter. "It's my father. I know it." "He believes he is saving you," Kael said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He looked down at her, his amber eyes soft. "Stay behind me. Do not show yourself until I command it." "I won't let you hurt him," Lyra said, her voice shaking. "And I won't let him take you," Kael promised. "But I will not make you an orphan, Lyra. On my life." The attack began with a rain of fire arrows. They arched through the mist, fizzing in the damp air, striking the trees around the cavern entrance. Then came the roar of men, 50 hunters, clad in leather and iron, charging up the slope. "Hold!" Kael roared to his own pack. The wolves, sensing the impending violence, were growling, ready to tear throats. "Defend! Do not kill unless you must. They are the Queen's kin." The clash was chaotic. Wolves lunged, knocking men down but refraining from the killing bite. Hunters swung heavy axes and fired crossbows. The clang of steel on stone and the yelps of pain echoed off the canyon walls. Harkin led the charge. He was a whirlwind of violence, cutting through the line of wolves with a singular, desperate focus. He saw the Alpha standing near the cavern mouth, the silver-haired man from the cave. "Beast!" Harkin screamed, raising his heavy crossbow. "Give her back!" Kael stepped forward. He didn't shift into his wolf form. He stood as a man, his alpha aura flaring around him like a shield, making the air ripple. He caught an arrow aimed at his chest out of the air, snapping the shaft in one hand. "She is not a prisoner, Harkin." Kael's voice boomed over the din of battle. "She is my heart." "Lies!" Harkin leveled his sword, charging. "You bewitched her." He swung the blade with lethal intent. Kael dodged, his movements a blur of superhuman speed. He sidestepped a blow that would have taken his head off, then shoved Harkin backward with an open palm. The force sent the hunter skidding 10 feet across the gravel. "Look at her!" Kael shouted, pointing behind him. Lyra ran out from the shelter of the rocks. She held her flute, her face pale but determined. "Father, stop, please." Harkin froze. He saw his daughter. She wasn't bound. She wasn't bleeding. She was standing beside the monster, her hand reaching out to him, not away from him. "Lyra?" Harkin lowered his sword slightly, confusion warring with his adrenaline. "Step away from him. He is a monster." "He is my mate," Lyra cried out, her voice cutting through the noise of the skirmish. "He saved me. He saved all of them." Harkin blinked, his world tilting. He looked at Kael. The Alpha wasn't attacking. He was standing in front of Lyra, his body a living shield, his hands open, showing he held no weapon. In the shadows of the tree line, Vorian watched. His plan was crumbling. The hunters were faltering, confused by the wolves' refusal to kill. Harkin was wavering. If they talked, if they made peace, Vorian was a dead man. He reached into his boot. He pulled out a dagger. It wasn't ordinary steel. The blade was coated in a thick, viscous purple liquid, concentrated essence of the shadow plague mixed with wolfsbane. A death sentence for any creature, human or wolf. He didn't aim for Kael. Kael was too fast. He would catch it or dodge. Vorian aimed for Harkin. If the hunter leader died here, in the middle of a werewolf den, the war would never end. The hunters would slaughter everyone in a blind rage. Vorian threw the knife. It hissed through the air, a streak of silent death aimed squarely between Harkin's shoulder blades. Kael heard it. His ears, sensitive enough to hear a heartbeat across a room, picked up the whistle of the blade. He smelled the poison, sulfur and rot. He saw the trajectory. It was going to hit Lyra's father. Kael didn't think. He didn't calculate the politics. He looked at Lyra's terrified face, then at the man she loved despite his flaws. Protect her pack. Kael moved. He threw himself across the gap between them. He didn't try to catch the knife. It was too close, too fast. He simply put his body in the way. Thwack. The sound was wet and sickening. The knife buried itself deep into Kael's back, just below the left shoulder blade, sinking to the hilt. Kael grunted, a sharp expulsion of breath. He stumbled forward, the momentum slamming him into Harkin. Harkin, stunned, caught the man who had just tackled him. He looked down, expecting to be bitten. Instead, he saw Kael's face contorted in agony, his eyes squeezed shut. "Run!" Kael gasped, gripping Harkin's leather armor. "Poison! Behind you!" Kael's legs gave out. He collapsed, sliding down Harkin to the ground. Harkin stared. He looked at the hilt protruding from Kael's back. It was a dagger. A throwing dagger. If Kael hadn't moved, that knife would have been in Harkin's spine. No. The scream tore Lyra's throat raw. She scrambled over the rocks, falling to her knees beside Kael. The battlefield went silent. Wolves and hunters alike stopped, sensing the shift in the air. The smell of the Alpha's blood, powerful, metallic, and now tainted with a sickly sweet rot, filled the clearing. "Kael." Lyra turned him over gently. His skin was already turning gray. The poison was incredibly potent, rushing through his veins, aided by his accelerated heart rate. Kael coughed, blood flecking his lips. It was black. "Did I?" Kael wheezed, his eyes struggling to focus on Lyra. "Did I save him?" Lyra looked at her father. Harkin was standing over them, his sword dangling from his hand, his face a mask of absolute shock. He looked from the fallen monster to the tree line where the knife had come from. He saw a gray cloak disappearing into the darkness. "Vorian. He saved me," Harkin whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He took the blade meant for me." "Father, help me," Lyra sobbed, pressing her hands over the wound on Kael's chest, trying to stem the flow of black blood. "It's the shadow poison. It's killing him." Harkin looked at his daughter. He saw the terror in her eyes, a terror not of the beast, but for the beast. He looked at the Wolf King, who was convulsing on the ground, fighting a battle he couldn't win with claws or teeth. The hatred that had fueled Harkin for 20 years, the ice around his heart, cracked. He dropped his sword. "What do you need?" Harkin asked, his voice gruff but urgent. He dropped to his knees on the other side of Kael. "Hold him up," Lyra commanded, panic giving way to a frantic healer's focus. "Don't let him close his eyes. I can't heal this with herbs." The poison was spreading visibly. The black veins were back, racing across Kael's chest, consuming the silver mark of their bond. His breathing was becoming a rattle. "Lyra," Kael whispered, his hand groping blindly for hers. "Don't cry. Soft, soft things." "Shut up," she wept, grabbing his hand. "Don't you dare say goodbye. Do you hear me, Kael? Do not dare." She looked around. The flute. It had fallen in the gravel when she ran. She scrambled to grab it. The bamboo was cracked. A hairline fracture ran down the side, likely from when she fell. "It's broken," she whispered, horror washing over her. "Play it," Harkin said. He placed a large, calloused hand on Kael's chest, feeling the erratic, fading heartbeat of the creature he had sworn to kill. "Play it, Lyra. Make it work." The hunters and the wolves formed a circle, weapons lowered, watching the tableau in the center. The mist swirled around them, but the silence was absolute. Lyra brought the cracked flute to her lips. Her tears dripped onto the wood. She didn't know if it would sound. She didn't know if she had enough magic left. But as she looked at Kael's face, the face of the man who had loved her when she was nothing, who had died for her father, she felt a power rise within her that was older and deeper than blood. She took a breath, and she began to play. Chapter 10. The Song of Silver Blood. The flute wheezed. It was a sickening, airy sound, like a dying bird. The crack in the bamboo was too deep. The air escaped before it could become music, carrying with it Lyra's last hope. Kael convulsed in Harkin's arms, his back arching off the cold stone. The black poison was no longer just in his veins. It was in the air, rising from his wound like a dark, choking smog. It swirled around them, cold and smelling of sulfur, threatening to suffocate the small circle of life they had formed. "It's not working," Lyra cried, her voice cracking. She tried again, blowing harder, but the instrument only hissed. "He's stopping," Harkin said, his voice grim. He had his hand over Kael's heart. The beat was fluttering, a moth trapped in a jar. Slowing, slowing. Lyra looked at the flute, then at her hand, the left hand, where the scar from the blood oath was still fresh. She looked at Kael's face, gray and still, the light behind his amber eyes fading into a dull, flat earth tone. "I am the healer of silver blood. My mother gave me this blood not to hide, but to bleed." She didn't reach for a knife. She didn't have time. In a frenzy of desperation, she brought her hand to her mouth and bit down hard on the fleshy part of her palm, right over the old wound. Pain flared, sharp and hot, but she welcomed it. She tore the skin until the metallic taste of copper and the sweet scent of vanilla filled her mouth. Blood welled up, thick, luminous and sparkling with that strange inner starlight. "Lyra?" Harkin watched, horrified and mesmerized. Lyra didn't answer. She smeared her bleeding palm over the crack in the bamboo flute. Her blood didn't just coat the wood, it bonded with it. It filled the fissure, glowing as it sealed the break, acting as a living mortar. She raised the flute to her lips again. Her hands were slick with crimson, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes were gray steel. "Live," she commanded the universe. "Come back to me." She blew. This time the sound didn't wheeze. It soared. The note that emerged was impossibly pure, a high, crystalline vibration that seemed to freeze the mist in the air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force. A ripple of silver light exploded from the end of the flute, expanding outward in a visible ring. The forbidden melody began. It was a song of defiance. It was the sound of the moon pulling the tide, of a seed cracking open the earth. It was violent in its beauty. As the music washed over Kael, his body went rigid. Harkin had to brace himself to keep hold of the massive wolf king. "Hold him!" Lyra screamed between breaths, her fingers flying over the holes of the flute. The silver shockwaves hit the black smog rising from Kael's chest. The darkness shrieked, a high, thin sound like tearing metal, and evaporated. But the melody didn't stop there. It grew louder, fueled by the blood seeping continuously from Lyra's hand into the wood. The silver light expanded, sweeping across the rocky ground, passing through the bewildered hunters and the cowering wolves. Where the light touched, fear vanished. Pain vanished. And in the shadows of the tree line, it found its target. Vorian had not gone far. He was lurking in the density of the pines, waiting for the wail of grief that would signal Kael's death. Instead, he saw the light. The silver wave hit him. Vorian screamed. It wasn't a scream of physical pain, but of ontological rejection. The shadow plague he had cultivated, the darkness he had allowed to fester in his soul, could not exist in the presence of such absolute purity. The silver blood was an antidote to all corruption. "No!" Vorian clawed at the air, his form flickering. He tried to shift, to run, but his legs dissolved into smoke. "I am the Alpha! I am—" The music swelled to a crescendo, a final triumphant trill. Vorian was simply wiped away. There was no body, no blood. Just a dissipating wisp of gray smoke that was caught by the valley wind and scattered into nothingness. Back in the clearing, the climax of the song hit Kael. The wound on his back hissed. The black sludge was expelled forcefully, sizzling on the rocks. In its place, new tissue knit together with impossible speed. The gray pallor of his skin flushed with gold. Lyra played the final note, holding it until her lungs were empty and her vision swam with black spots. The flute slipped from her blood-slicked fingers. She collapsed forward. She didn't hit the ground. Strong arms caught her. Not Harkin's. Lyra blinked, fighting the darkness of exhaustion. She looked up. Kael was sitting up. He was holding her. His chest was heaving, his skin was soaked in sweat, but his eyes were two burning suns of molten amber, rimmed with a brilliant, permanent silver. He was alive. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice vibrating against her ribs. "My soul." He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply, shuddering with the aftershocks of the resurrection. He held her as if he would crush her, yet his touch was reverent, terrifyingly tender. "You came back," she whispered, her hand finding his cheek, smearing her blood on his skin. "You called?" he said simply. "I could not sleep when you were singing." He turned his head to look at Harkin. The hunter leader was still kneeling on the ground, his hands empty, his armor stained with Kael's blood. He stared at the man he had hated for decades. He looked at the spot where the fatal wound had been, now just a pale scar. Harkin looked at his daughter, curled in the werewolf's lap, safe, cherished, and powerful beyond measure. Slowly, Harkin reached out. Kael stiffened, a low rumble starting in his chest, protective, wary. "Easy," Harkin said, his voice gruff. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for Kael's shoulder. He gripped the king's shoulder firmly, a warrior's gesture. Acknowledgement. "You took the blade," Harkin said. "You saved my life." "You are her father," Kael replied, the rumble fading into a calm baritone. "Her blood is your blood." Harkin looked at Lyra. He saw the way she looked at Kael, as if he were the only gravity in her world. He saw the silver scar on her hand. He realized he had lost his daughter to the woods, but he hadn't lost her to a monster. He had lost her to a king. Harkin nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He stood up and turned to his men. The hunters were watching, weapons lowered, awestruck by the magic they had witnessed. "Lower your bows!" Harkin bellowed. "The war is over!" The wolves, sensing the shift, emerged from the rocks. They didn't attack. They looked to Kael. Kael stood up, lifting Lyra with him. He was weak, swaying slightly, but he stood tall. He looked at his pack, then at the hunters. "Tonight," Kael announced, his voice carrying on the wind that smelled of ozone and vanilla, "we do not bleed. Tonight, we heal." He looked down at Lyra, his gaze softening until the rest of the world melted away. He touched his forehead to hers. "Take me home, Lyra," he whispered. "I'm tired." "I've got you," she promised. As the sun began to crest over the peaks of the misty valley, piercing the eternal fog, the silver river sparkled below them. It no longer looked like a barrier dividing two worlds. It looked like a bridge. Chapter 11. Dawn in the Valley. The mist that had choked the misty valley for centuries did not vanish overnight, but it had changed. It no longer clung to the ground like a shroud of dread. Instead, it drifted high in the canopy of the ancient pines, catching the morning light and scattering it into soft, golden ribbons. 3 months had passed since the Battle of the Cavern. Lyra stood before a polished silver mirror in the royal quarters of the Crystal Cavern. The room, once stark and cold, was now filled with life. Woven rugs from the Hunter's Keep covered the stone floors, and vases of wild flowers, fire lilies and moon orchids, perfumed the air with a sweet, heady fragrance. She smoothed the fabric of her dress. It was not the heavy wool of a hunter, nor the rough leathers of the wild. It was a gown of pale, shimmering gray silk, embroidered with silver threads that looked like vines climbing up her waist. It was a dress that belonged to neither world and therefore belonged perfectly to her. "You look..." A soft voice spoke from the doorway. Lyra turned. It was a young wolf girl, the very same pup Lyra had healed first. She was holding a wooden box with both hands, her eyes wide with admiration. "Like the moon," the girl finished shyly. Lyra smiled, her heart warming. "Thank you, Alara. Is it time?" "Almost," Alara said, stepping forward. "But a runner came from the riverbank. He brought this. He said it was from the keep. From the Lord Harkin." The air in the room went still. Lyra's breath hitched. She hadn't seen her father since that night. They had exchanged messages, formal treaties, trade agreements, boundaries. But he had remained in his fortress, and she in her cavern. She took the box. It was heavy, made of dark polished oak. There was no letter. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black velvet, lay a flute. But it was not made of bamboo. It was carved from a single piece of flawless, translucent green jade. It was a masterwork, the kind of treasure that took a lifetime to craft or a fortune to acquire. Lyra ran her fingers over the cool stone. It was smooth, heavy, and solid. Unlike the bamboo, which had cracked under pressure, this stone would endure. It was a silent message from a man of few words. "You are strong. You are precious. You endure." Tucked beneath the flute was a small scrap of parchment with jagged handwriting. For the wind, and for the peace. Tears pricked Lyra's eyes. He wasn't coming. He was too proud, too steeped in his old ways to stand amidst a pack of wolves and celebrate, but he had given his blessing. He had accepted that her melody belonged to the valley now. "The Alpha is waiting," Alara whispered, beaming. "And he is very impatient." Lyra laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "He usually is." She picked up the jade flute. It felt right in her hand. cool, grounding. She walked out of the room, through the winding tunnels illuminated by glowing crystals, and into the main cavern. The sight that greeted her took her breath away. The vast crystal cavern had been transformed. The roof was open to the sky through the great fissures, and shafts of sunlight rained down, illuminating the dust motes like floating gold. The hall was packed. On the left stood the wolves, dressed in their finest furs and leathers. On the right stood a delegation of hunters, uncomfortable but respectful, their weapons left at the entrance. But Lyra saw none of them. She only saw him. Kael stood at the altar, a natural formation of quartz that pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light. He was breathtaking. He wore a tunic of deep charcoal, open at the collar, revealing the faint, pale scar where the poison dagger had struck, a mark he refused to hide, a badge of his devotion. His black hair was tied back, emphasizing the sharp, regal lines of his jaw. When he saw her, the rest of the room ceased to exist for him. His amber eyes flared with a heat that made Lyra's knees weak. He didn't wait for her to walk the full length of the aisle. He took a step forward, then another, his restraint crumbling. He met her halfway, right in the center of the room where the humans and wolves merged. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of her chest. He reached out, his large, warm hands engulfing hers. He looked at her as if he were starving, and she was the only sustenance in the world. There was no manic possession in his gaze, only a deep, profound reverence. "You waited," she teased softly, squeezing his hands. "I have waited my whole life for you," Kael replied, his thumb stroking her knuckles. 3 minutes more was torture. He led her to the altar, not walking ahead of her, but beside her. Equals. The ceremony was simple. There were no long speeches, no complex rituals. It was an exchange of essence. An elder wolf bound their hands together with a braided cord of silver silk and leather. "Do you," the elder rasped, "Lyra of the silver blood, accept the heart of the wolf?" "I do," Lyra said, her voice clear and steady. "I accept the heart, the claw, and the soul." "And do you?" The elder turned to Kael. "Kael, king of the valley, accept the spirit of the healer?" Kael didn't look at the elder. He looked at Lyra, his eyes shimmering with that inner silver light. "I do not just accept it," Kael vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I will guard it. I will hunt for it. I will bleed for it. She is my breath. Without her, there is no air." He leaned down, and the kiss was not polite. It was searing. It was a seal placed upon her soul. He kissed her with the desperation of a man who had died and come back to life, pouring every ounce of his gratitude and passion into the contact. The room erupted. Wolves howled, a joyous, melodic sound that rose to the ceiling. The hunters cheered, banging their mugs on the tables. The sound of the two factions blending was the sweetest music Lyra had ever heard. Later that night, when the feasting was done and the moon was high and full, they escaped. They stood on the high balcony of the cavern, overlooking the valley. The silver river wound through the landscape below, a ribbon of mercury reflecting the stars. Kael stood behind Lyra, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. She could feel the solid wall of his muscles, the steady, slow beat of his heart against her back. He had nuzzled his face into the curve of her neck, his breath hot and rhythmic. He was making that sound again, the low, vibrating purr that he only made when he was completely at peace. It was a sound of safety. "Are you happy?" Lyra asked, leaning her head back against his shoulder. Kael kissed the sensitive spot behind her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "I am full," he murmured. "No more hunger. No more cold." He reached around and covered her hands, which were resting on the stone railing. His fingers traced the cool surface of the jade flute she still held. "Play for me?" he asked softly. "Play the song of the dawn." Lyra raised the jade flute to her lips. She closed her eyes and blew. The sound was richer than the bamboo, deeper and more resonant. It flowed out over the valley, weaving through the trees, crossing the river, and touching the walls of the hunter's keep in the distance. It was a melody of healing. It was a promise that the darkness had passed. As she played, Kael tightened his hold on her, resting his chin on her shoulder, closing his eyes to listen. The silver moon shone down on them, the Wolf King and his healer, bathing them in a light that was no longer cold, but infinite and warm. The forbidden melody was forbidden no longer. It was the anthem of their life. And in the silence of the misty valley, for the first time in 1,000 years, there was only peace.